Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zubko. India's diplomacy has undergone a remarkable transformation in recent decades, evolving from non-alignment to strategic autonomy as it navigates through relationships with major powers while championing the interests of the global south. Today we explore how the world's most populous democracy is leveraging its economic rise, cultural soft power, and diplomatic pragmatism to reshape the international order and secure its place as an indispensable player on the global stage. My guest today is Dr. Vineet Thakur. Hello?
Hi, Martin. Thank you for having me.
Vineet Thakur is a university lecturer in international relations at Leiden University in the Netherlands, whose work critically explores the politics of knowledge production and intellectual history of IR from post-colonial perspectives. He is the author of influential books, and one of them is one of my favorites, India's First Diplomat, V.S. Srinivasa Sastry and the Making of Liberal Internationalism. And this book offers some unique thoughts on India's diplomacy. Vineet's scholarship has been recognized with major academic awards and for reshaping understanding of international relations beyond Eurocentric paradigms. So let's speak about India's diplomacy. And my first question goes to history. And I would like to know, how has the concept of Mandala theory from Kautilya's Arthashastra influenced India's contemporary approach to neighboring states? I just want to make a little note that Kautilya's Arthashastra is a script, or it's like several scripts all together dealing with the India statecraft, and it comes to history, to old times.
Thank you very much, Martin. Also, thank you very much for this really kind introduction. On Kautilya's Arthashastra, and in particular his Mandala theory, which is basically this whole argument that of thinking about a foreign policy in terms of concentric circles, wherein the idea is that if you are at the center of the concentric circle as a state, with each succeeding concentric circles, the states that are in those circles would be friends or enemies or friends. So the first concentric circle around you is enemy, and the ones next to them are friends, and so on and so forth. The question was that how much it influences India's contemporary approach. I think personally, I don't think policymakers think about it too much. But also, I think Arthashastra is more prescriptive rather than explanatory. It puts forward this series of precepts of how the king should behave, and like you said, it's a treatise on statecraft, and which in some ways are not really specific to India. It's more generally about how the state should behave, and it's a bit more like, I think, Machiavelli's Prince, which in a way may help us to understand how broadly power operates, but it doesn't necessarily would explain how individual states or leaders think. And it's kind of the same about India, I think. Because especially concerning India's neighboring states, India is a hegemonic power, right? India is this large, burly state, which is surrounded by really these small states. So India doesn't necessarily see them as enemies, and the ones after them, next to them, as friends. In fact, it's quite, except perhaps Pakistan. Pakistan is a bit of an exception. All these states are militarily far weaker, again, with the exception of Pakistan. So I think quite in contrast to Mandala, India's foreign policy in some ways has required to be a benevolent regional hegemon. I'm not saying that India is a benevolent regional hegemon, but that's what India aspires to be. So in a way, Mandala doesn't necessarily work for India, for understanding India's regional relations, at least.
And is there any other work that you might mention and which might influence the decision-making processes in India's diplomacy? Because I want to get in historical roots, like what we can consider as something that Indians people who want to be diplomats, people who want to study diplomacy, maybe they have a look and they have some inspiration. Maybe they see themselves, it's great figures in the future.
I mean, so there have been sort of some recent works. One good example is India's Foreign Minister, S.J. Shankar, who wrote this book about, who's written a couple of books on India's foreign policy, India's diplomatic history, and he sort of constantly emphasizes the whole idea of India being a civilizational state. India looks at the region around it as sort of a civilizational state, and which to me is again sort of quite problematic. But that's sort of the other lens through which some people have tried to look at India's foreign policy. Again, I'm not a big sort of fan of that term, but that's another term that is often employed by Indians to to try and sort of understand Indian foreign policy.
And we must be a little bit critical because we are academics and we like to be critical. So when we say that India is civilizational state, there might be some sort of argument coming from the post-colonial perspectives, and people might say, how valid is this claim when modern Indian diplomacy was largely shaped by British colonial administrative practices? So this might be something I think we should explain.
Right. Thank you. So there are two things here. One is that the claim that India is a civilizational state, it's an ideational claim. It's a claim that people have been making since Nehru. Nehru thought of India as a civilizational state. And his argument was that India and China are these two great civilizational states, sort of as against sort of the Westphalian Western states. And what separated India from China also was that India has the civilizational value of pacifism. So India was a civilizationally pacifist state. That's how he presented sort of India. And that's kind of sort of something that most Indian leaders and policymakers have tried to project India as. And the example that I was giving, S.J. Shankar's, the whole idea of then India is also civilization and so on and so forth. But then the second question, and that itself is problematic, what is a civilizational state? It's very difficult to sort of define. But second, I think the more concrete issue that you got to, okay, what does it mean in terms of India's diplomatic practice? And like you said, India's diplomatic practice is shaped by, British administrative sort of systems. But more generally, I think any state's sort of diplomatic practice is shaped by the sphere that they operate in, which in our case is the modern international system. So there is no innate Indian diplomatic style which is shaped by civilizational consciousness, right? So, for example, one of the books which made this claim came out a few years ago. It's a book. I've forgotten that it's called. I've forgotten the title of the book, but it's by this author called Deepdutta Ray, who argues that Western diplomats really cannot understand Indian diplomats because Indian diplomats have been trained in their training. They read Mahabharata, which is an Indian sort of text, and because they read some of these Indian texts, they draw their ideas of rationality from those Indian texts. And I've always wondered, but these Indian diplomats read these texts in English, right? There is no innate sort of different sense of rationality that anybody else who is outside India cannot understand from the same text because they are in English, right? So the sense that there is some different version of rationality that exists in Indian texts to me is sort of befuddling. Similarly, in Jayashankar's book on India, he talks about how Indian diplomatic practice is shaped by Indian classical texts like Ramayana and Mahabharata. And then the examples that he goes on to give are like basic commonsensical examples. He would give you a tale from Ramayana and say, okay, this is how strategic behavior has to happen, or this is how Indians used to behave strategically. But that is like commonsensical stuff, right? How do you deal with your neighbors? That is commonsensical stuff. You don't need sort of a civilizational consciousness to arrive at that. So I think a lot of these arguments about civilizational diplomatic practices, they are a way of sort of self-aggrandizing in some ways. But in practice, I don't think there are any innate diplomatic practices. which are or innate sort of Indian practices which are shaped by civilization values. What they are shaped by are, of course, sort of the modern international system. That's where the rules of diplomacy are decided. But of course, also the experiences of India in this modern international system. So one could argue that Indian diplomatic practice is certainly shaped by experiences of colonialism, for instance. But to argue that there is a civilizational sort of stream sort of running from 5,000 years that shapes, how Indians talk, that I think is a bit of a.
British diplomacy is often associated with elitism, that diplomats come from the elite school graduates and from the posh families. In India, there is a caste system, which is the hierarchy. Can you please explain us how this influence the diplomacy of India or people who are joining India's diplomatic corps?
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Martin. That's a very important question. And this is something that I've recently worked on with a few colleagues. So we did this special issue on caste and diplomacy. And this is exactly the question that we discuss. I think first is this question of, so who are these Indian diplomats? And in India's sort of 80 years history, and even longer, if you consider that Indian diplomacy actually starts in 1920s, a large proportion of these diplomats come from upper caste sort of backgrounds, which means that they bring in sort of the mores and modes of sort of that upper caste Indian sort of setup. Now, this influences Indian diplomacy in a couple of ways, and I'm not going to go into sort of long details. But first, it shapes the worldviews. The caste background that you come from shapes your worldviews, which also are important for diplomacy. So, for instance, think about non-alignment or non-violence, which is, as I was saying, Nehru talks about India's sort of civilization value as a value of pacifism. So this idea of pacifism, this idea of non-violence being inherent to India, and therefore Indian foreign policy is non-violent. And this idea of India being non-violent is a moral idea, that India has to be this moral power in the world, and that morality is expressed through non-violence. But here, the conception of non-violence as moral is based on sort of a very specific understanding of non-violence, which is that non-violence is, as we all know, it's sort of, not committing violence on others, but the idea that that is inherently a good thing. Now, think of a deeply oppressive system. In a deeply oppressive system, if I'm the oppressed and somebody else is the oppressor, and the oppressor tells me to be, well, let's be non-violent, that becomes a form of oppression, right? Violence in a lot of situations allows for possibilities of revolution, right? So there is nothing innately wrong about violence, just as there is nothing innately good about non-violence. In a deeply oppressive system, non-violence allows for continuation of oppression. And this sort of, if you think about sort of in the Indian sort of caste system, if one argues that caste system has then been there for 5,000 years, which has been dominated by upper castes, and at the top of that hierarchy are Brahmins, who are actually known for their non-violence, because they are known for controlling society through knowledge rather than violence. Violence becomes an instrument which is seen as a sort of delegitimized instrument of change of power, because Brahmins cannot, if there is violence used in the society, Brahmins cannot continue with their dominance. So this is at a very basic level where non-violence as a system, or the idea of non-violence, has allowed Brahmins to continue with sort of a caste, sort of this caste hierarchy for whatever, 5,000 years. So in that system, non-violence as a moral posture becomes a very conservative position. And this is some of the criticism that was actually sort of leveled at somebody like Nehru from B.R. Ambedkar, who was one of the sort of who was the main drafter of the Indian Constitution, but one of the most important sort of thinkers, anti-caste thinkers we've had in the past 100 years. And he argued that why do you make your foreign policy about nonviolence as a moral practice? Why can't you engage in foreign policy as a transactional practice, right? For instance, if you're dealing with Pakistan, why don't we think about Kashmir in terms of sort of how France and America thought about Louisiana? It was a transaction that they made, right? Why do you always make an issue of sort of moral practice? So, anyways, the whole point being that a lot of times when Indian foreign policy projects itself as this sort of moral, whatever, with a certain kind of moral vision of the world, that moral vision comes from a certain Brahmanical way of thinking about the world. And one can sort of talk about several other concepts in that India talks about. For instance, the current Modi government talks about, India being a Vishwa Guru and sort of this, uh, sort of what is called Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that the whole world is a home and so on and so forth. All of these concepts, in a way, come from a Brahminical way of thinking. So that is sort of the first in sort of in a discursive realm. The ideas that come from very specific sort of caste order. Second is, and what are the solutions offered? And I just give one example. So in 1950, the Indian Foreign Service officer, or rather the Indian representative of the UN, was a guy called B.N. Rao, um, who was having these conversations with South African diplomats, and at that point, India and South Africa were in a sort of were in a massive tussle at the United Nations, where India had taken South Africa to the UN against their treatment of Indians, against their racist treatment of Indians. And B.N. Rao says to the South African, his sort of South African counterpart, that look, we understand why you want to bar Indians from coming to South Africa, and why don't you want to give, why you don't want to give equal rights to Indians in South Africa, because most of these Indians come from the schoolie class, which is sort of the supposed lower class in India, lower castes in India. So we understand your problems, we understand questions of purity, we understand questions of hygiene, and we understand why you're opposed to them getting equal rights. But what you can do is that why don't you allow a certain quota of Indians who you can give equal rights to, say about 200 people. If you give those 200 people equal rights, if you allow them into South Africa, then we don't mind you discriminate against the rest of the Indians. Because then the discrimination that you practice is not racial, it's not racist, right? And this is something that, as Indians, we'd be fine with, because then this becomes, you can argue, there's a class discrimination or caste discrimination, but this is not a racist discrimination. And he argues, and we would be happy to provide you with the best kind of Indians, which is basically upper caste Indians, sort of to fulfill that quota. So that is a practical solution that is coming from an Indian diplomat who is an upper caste Indian diplomat, who is basically giving South Africans a way out of their racism by arguing that why don't you practice casteism, right? So you find several instances like this in Indian diplomacy where upper caste Indian diplomats practice this form of sort of discrimination, not just against fellow Indians, but also against some of the diplomats of other countries. So at Bandung Conference in 1955, for instance, Indian diplomats were horrifically sort of used to pass horrific comments against, say, Indonesian diplomats on the basis of this understanding of a certain hierarchy where Indians thought they were more civilized and hygienic and so on and so forth, whereas Indonesians were not. So this is sort of seeped into the practice of Indian diplomacy, but unfortunately hasn't been written about much. But there is definite sort of effect that this has on the practice of Indian diplomacy.
And how do you think that this caste system is going to continue in the future? Do you see there will be some changes, or do you see that it will be sustained because this is a tradition in India?
I mean, there are two things. One is that, one could argue that in India, in terms of the caste system, because of urban mobility and a whole lot of these things, the traditional way in which we understood caste, that's kind of changing. But casteism isn't. You can practice casteism without, sort of without the traditional caste system. So, casteism in modern India, there's a wonderful book by Ajanta Subramaniam, who argues that how sort of this casteism operates through the idea of merit in India, that who is meritocratic. It's usually your merit you accumulate through your social capital, right? But for instance, I'll give my own example, right? I have been able to get a certain kind of education, have a certain kind of job, uh, and because of that, I can argue that I'm meritocratic, and because I'm meritocratic, I can, I would begin to argue that I'm actually casteless. My caste doesn't matter. So, um, to argue that you don't have a caste is itself a product of caste privilege. And in India, that's what you see. So a lot of people would profess to not have any caste and so on and so forth. They renounce their caste, but that they can do because of the privilege. Whereas a lot of caste politics in India is engaged by those who suffer from sort of the problems of casteism, right? So in a way, you have this very strange paradox where a lot of people would argue caste doesn't exist and so on and so forth because they think they don't practice casteism, but you know all their positions that they've accumulated is a form of sort of caste privilege, whereas those who are sort of disprivileged by caste order are the ones who sort of push for its recognition, who push for recognition of sort of caste hierarchies. So it's that's how it's sort of morphing in India now.
There is an interesting chapter of India's diplomacy regarding the Cold War. And I have two questions here. The first one is about the Nehruvian idealism, which might influence the diplomacy of India. And the second one, some people argue that it was a non alignment from India as a strategic autonomy. And the others, they say it was a pragmatic hedging, so what India can get. And I think we don't want to go deeper into politics, but from the diplomatic point of view, from the diplomatic practices, how would you evaluate this period of India's diplomacy?
Thanks very much, Martin, again for those questions. I think first, as a historian, you know, uh, this whole idea of Nehruvian idealism, I think it is it's an invention of a generation of scholars who never really went to the archives, right? Uh, so there is certainly a moralism in Nehruvian foreign policy, as I was mentioning, but I don't think that's idealism. It's not that, if you look at sort of how Nehruvian foreign policies was concretely manifested, um, it very much takes into consideration, India's material power, the sphere that it is operating in, and what are the aspirations of India. There is nothing idealistic about that. I mean, think about it, for instance. India is a country with very little or weak material power, and still it's punching way above its weight. So that, in some ways, it maximizes its status. In fact, I think India's status has never been higher in international sort of order, including today, uh, compared to sort of the Nehruvian era of the 1950s. So I'm sort of a bit allergic when people talk about Nehruvian idealism because it doesn't really take into consideration, the material conditions of the time. Uh, India is, I mean, during at least the 50s and 60s, India is one of the most important countries at that moment. It is from the point of view of the decolonial nations, right? Most of the sort of decolonial nations actually look up to people like Nehru in India at that point. But India is also operating in this sort of in the times of Cold War when the two blocks are sort of, at least from Nehruvian perspective, hell bent on destroying the world, and India could not see itself as succumbing to either. So it's trying to maintain, like you said, it's kind of a pragmatic hedging that India is doing in its non-alignment. So, and if you look at like very specific episodes of Indian foreign policy, I think there is a lot of considered thinking. It's not coming out of this some idealistic vision of the world. It's very much engaging with sort of realistic issues at the time, and offering realistic solutions. So I think, yeah, I mean, idealism, sort of Nehruvian idealism, is sort of a a bit of a mischaracterization, I think, of the period. It is quite realist, considering the situation, considering the sort of the system that it is operating in. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been failures. Of course, there have been failures. The China debacle is sort of the one that is often thrown at Nehruvian foreign policy as this sort of failure of his idealism. But as this one of the most prominent Indian realist thinkers, A.P. Rana, uh, said once that you don't evaluate a whole theory with one failure, right? So you don't evaluate Nehru's whole foreign policy of whatever 17 years through just one failure. In a way, you can also explain that one failure through how it was a failure of realism. But nevertheless, the point being that I think that is a bit of a mischaracterization. Now, then coming to, I think the other point then you said, then what was non-alignment? Is it sort of genuine strategic autonomy or a pragmatic hedging? I think it's kind of both, right? As a historian, I would probably not make absolutist arguments. Because in some ways it's very difficult to separate the two. Which part is strategic autonomy and what is pragmatic hedging? They both kind of can be explained through the same incidences, right? The only thing I would say is that non-alignment was not neutrality, right? Non-alignment is basically weighing your option with each issue and being very involved actually in world issues from a position of your own self-interest. So rather than sort of tethering your interests in advance to one specific power block, that's all that non-alignment was. And I think to a great extent, Nehruvian foreign policy and sort of even subsequent foreign policy, in a way, has managed to do that. Not always, but to a great extent, it has. There is some difference, however, between sort of the more of the Nehruvian foreign policy to what follows afterwards. I think Nehruvian foreign policy is more ideational. I think it's more attentive to sort of context. It's more sort of, it moves quite a bit. Whereas after him, and predominantly during the reign of his daughter, Indira Gandhi, non-alignment becomes more of an ideological position rather than ideational position. So that's what I'd say about, yeah, non-alignment.
Is there any characteristics or any, let's say, misinterpreted sort of like notion about India's diplomacy during the Cold War that you consider as important to clarify? Or maybe there is something that we don't know because we don't read that much. Maybe there are not enough publications about this notion, but you think that it's important to know, and maybe researchers and our viewers can, after you explain a few things, maybe they can have a look, and maybe it's gonna be fascinating for them to research or maybe to write some articles.
Yep, right. I think one is, so in the early 90s, there was a lot of these publications that came out talking about Indian foreign policy, and these I think were largely scholars who drew a lot on the secondary literature that was produced in the 50s and 60s and 70s about Indian foreign policy. And there was sort of almost a consensus about that, like you said, about Nehruvian idealism. That were in this period of idealism and post 1991, after Indian sort of reforms of liberalization, India became sort of a more of a realist power. In fact, there were publications which said, Indian foreign policy doesn't exist before 1991. And a lot of that was because nobody went to the archives. Nobody actually cared to look at how did Indian foreign policy actually operate. So post 2010s, I think there have been a lot of scholars who've gone to the archives who are sort of now sort of discovering, what India was actually doing in the 50s and 60s, and the picture is far, far, far more complex. I mean, Indian diplomacy and Indian diplomats were one, of course, very involved, but also sort of thinking about issues of world politics from several different sort of perspectives. And sort of and sort of a lot of negotiations that were also going on. They were very pragmatic, right? So this whole sort of period of the 50s and 60s and the 70s has been kind of a bit of an unknown in Indian diplomatic history. But a lot of this is now being, I think, sort of rediscovered, I think, by a lot. diplomatic historians. So the big change that has been is sort of the discovery of diplomatic history by a lot of Indian scholars. And I think more and more of that sort of happens, we'll know more and more about what was happening in the 50s and 60s and 70s.
The next notion I want to mention is neighborhood policy, neighborhood first policy. I think it's a very interesting concept and there are many implications, but also there are two views. The first one is like it helps India to maintain friendly relations with neighbors, with the countries around. And the second opinion is about is it stable? Is it really achieving its goals? And there are some doubts. So let's explain that neighborhood first policy and how much does it influence contemporary India's diplomacy?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so neighborhood policy, or at least India's neighborhood policy, there have been two views about it. Uh, One is that, is it and it's primarily seen in terms of India's path to great power. Like, what is India's path to great power? If India needs to become sort of a bigger power, it needs to be first sort of a hegemon in its own region, right? So India becomes big power by through its region. And the second argument, which has been advanced nowadays by some scholars, including I think Happy Mohan Jacob wrote this sort of very provocative article in Foreign Affairs, where the argument is that India needs to skip its neighborhood because India's neighborhood is full of problems, is unstable. India gets sort of too bogged down in its neighborhood, which means that India can never realize its great power potential. So India just needs to skip its neighborhood. And those are kind of two views. One of the sort of most important issues I think in India's neighborhood policy is lack of any kind of regional mechanism, right? Or developing or lack of development of any kind of regional cooperation mechanisms. The only one we had, SARC, which was a South Asian regional organization that never really took off. Because of India and Pakistan's problems. So Pakistan has always been, as far as India is concerned, Pakistan has always been that one big issue that's dominated India's neighborhood agenda, and because of which India hasn't been able to sort of have a proper sort of a regional cooperation mechanism in the neighborhood. Now, if you have a regional cooperation, if you have a regional organization that does a lot of tasks for you, right, and that underwrites the whole regional sort of system for you. Now, in case of India, that hasn't been possible, which has been like I think probably the biggest failure of Indian diplomacy as far as sort of the region is concerned. But then, I mean, with regard to Indian diplomacy, I think the other problem has also been that, some of the Indian diplomats in the region have kind of behaved like these imperial satraps. They have behaved in ways which has ticked off sort of some of the regional powers we have. Now, there's something Nehru used to say that he used to say that India has to understand that no matter what it does, whether it's being nice to its neighbors or whatever, it is this big burly neighbor, and which will always be seen in a threatening way by its neighbors because of the mere size. So India has to sort of cop out some criticism. India has to accept some criticism that comes its way, and not react to it. Unfortunately, in India's case, and I think India reacts to a lot of the criticism and the insecurities that come from regional neighborhoods, which hasn't been sort of, I think, which hasn't been sort of a good neighborhood policy. So, so personally, I don't think India can escape the region. I think India needs to sort of, if India has sort of great power ambitions, it needs to go through the region. It needs to sort of help in the stabilization region. It needs to help in actually greater economic trade. South Asia is probably one of the most densely populated regions in the world, but it is also one of the least economically integrated regions in the world. And that says something about the hegemon that leads the region, right? So it's been the failure of the hegemon. So India has to, I think, double down on its neighborhood rather than withdraw. And unfortunately, it's the withdrawing part which India seems to be doing the past couple of decades. Yeah.
So, if we turn this question around, do you see an alternative to neighborhood first policy?
No, I think, like I said, India has to engage more in the neighborhood. India has to find ways for greater economic cooperation in the neighborhood, purely because it's, like I said, it's one of the most densely populated regions in the world. So imagine the economic potential that the region has. So I think there is no escape there. India has to find a way of sort of becoming more involved in the region.
Let's touch a little bit quite sensitive diplomatic issue, and that's the India and Pakistan. And I want to ask you from the historical perspective and from your research, uh, we had a dialogue, now we have isolation. And many ask, does it mean that there is sort of deadlock in India's diplomacy towards Pakistan?
I mean, there is, but the question is whether that has succeeded. The policy of isolation of Pakistan, which India has done since, I don't know, 2016, 17, whether that has succeeded. Uh, I mean, one of the reasons was the terror attacks. The terror attacks haven't stopped. The second reason was that India didn't want to hyphenate itself with Pakistan, and India wanted Pakistan globally isolated. Now, if you see what's happening sort of recently, especially during the Trump administration, it's quite on the contrary. Pakistan seems to be actually much better placed than even India with the Trump administration. And India's biggest, I think, diplomatic failure of recent times was perhaps the failure to get a sympathetic ear in any of the, or in most of the world capitals in the aftermath of the short India-Pakistan confrontation we had in May, right? So it is India's sort of policy of isolating Pakistan hasn't. I think when the world looks at India and Pakistan, it looks at this danger of a nuclear war. It wants India and Pakistan to sort of actually engage. So, and eventually, I think Pakistan is a neighbor, whether India likes it or not. It has to be engaged with. Indians are talking to Taliban. Indians are talking to a genocidal state like Israel. So, but won't talk to Pakistan. So it baffles me. So I think that this sort of whole policy of isolation has been quite counterproductive. And in the long term, yeah, I don't think it's beneficial.
And there is a sort of advanced layer on this question, and that's the influence or impact of Chinese diplomacy on India's approach to Pakistan. Because we saw that the Shanghai organization is getting Pakistan a bit closer. We saw some weapons coming to Pakistan from India. Then, as you mentioned, the latest development. And I'm thinking, and maybe some scholars as well, like maybe that sort of, is there sort of influence from China? And if so, is it possible to describe it?
I mean, so the China-Pakistan relationship has always been one, I think, that's been built keeping India in context, right? Um, and India is always, and I think India's issue there is that, India has to think of China also in terms of the United States, right? Which is the bigger power. So when India, for instance, went to the SCO this time, it was because of Trump's tariffs. Otherwise, India was actually trying to distance itself from China, right? So I think the China angle in India's sort of Pakistan relationship will remain as long as issues exist in India and China relationship. So I think primarily India has to address its China relationship rather than worrying too much about the support that Pakistan gets from China, because that's sort of a byproduct of the relationship India has with China.
And what about Tibet? That's also quite sensitive. And I think we sort of under research Tibet. I mean, I would like to have more publications, more papers about Tibet, India, and China. What's important when we speak about India's diplomacy regarding Tibet? And also, based on your research, is there anything that we should mention as India's either success or failure?
I mean, Tibet, if you think about like historically, from the very early on, from the 1950s, when Indian leaders like Nehru sort of started about it, I think they've always thought of Tibet through these two registers. One is that Tibet was a strategic asset because the British had thought it so, right? the British had sent a mission to Tibet, which then, when India became independent, India continued with it for some time. But Nehru, for instance, always thought of it as sort of a British ploy. It's a colonial thing that the British did to sort of embed Tibet's interests into India's, or into the interests of the British Empire, to sort of basically weaken the Chinese empire. Uh, and then, so Nehru, I think, in some ways, always thought that China actually had a legitimate sort of a claim to Tibet. But because the British had sort of involved India into it, so there was some strategic element to it. And sort of Nehru, I think, was always torn between these two. But in a way, he'd kind of conceded to China on Tibet's, it was called suzerainty, right? That Tibet is part of China. And Nehru had conceded to it, and sort of to China. And for the longest part, I think most of the Indian governments have taken that position. Even I think, Prime Minister Vajpayee, sort of a couple of decades ago, went to China and accepted that China has suzerainty over Tibet. So I think that part, although there is sort of a Tibetan government in exile in India, it is as a human rights issue, but I think strategically thinking, India keeps Tibet on a low burn, sort of on a slow burn, uh, because whenever issues arise with sort of China, India can play the Tibet card. But I think what hurts India more nowadays is that when China plays the Tibet card, because historically China thinks of what is called South Tibet, which is parts of sort of Indian territory in Arunachal, which then China claims to be its own territory. So sort of raking up the Tibet issue in a way becomes also sometimes counterproductive to China, because it's counterproductive to sort of its own strategy, because then that allows China to claim parts of India as its own. So it's sort of a complicated issue, and I think what India, for most part, I think India keeps it sort of on a slow burn. It doesn't talk about it often. It actually tries to keep it fairly contained. But it is a card that India once in a while would use, because Tibet is also an issue on which there is a whole lot of Western sympathy that India gets. So that's how I think India thinks about Tibet. Yeah.
With the Ukraine war, or war in Ukraine, there is energy question, and we know that India and Russia and the oil and all those things all together, and this is influencing how we think about India. And there is more sort of impact or talks about the India's multi-alignment strategy. Some people say, well, they want to be friends with the USA, then they're buying energy from Russia, then they want to be friends with the European Union. And everyone is speaking about how India is aligning to where and to who. And then we have those thoughts like, is it a Western narrative that it's just requiring, that you must align with someone? Or is it evolution of non-alignment strategy coming from India to be India as a world player in the geopolitical dynamics and settings? But then we're thinking, what about if India is going to be in crisis? Who is going to help India? Who from those alignment countries? USA, Russia, or China, or others, or European Union. So how do you see that evolution of multi-alignment strategy when we speak about India's diplomacy?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think you initially said whether it's sort of Western way of thinking about it, that you have to align, or is it multi-alignment. I think it's both, right? And I think um, as our former minister Jaishankar said, and sort of basically plagiarizing actually from Nehru, that Europe has to think, that the world is bigger than Europe. And Europe only thinks of the world from its own perspective. And thinking from the Indian perspective, I mean, there are about, I think, 640 million people who live below poverty line in India. So energy, is a matter of life and death for millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people in India. So India will try and get energy cheaper from wherever it sort of can, right? So the Ukraine war, I mean, yes, it's sort of important for West and it's important for Europe, but it's a bit too far for India, and it's not It's not a question that I think India or Indians think about a lot. So it's a very pragmatic decision that way, which is not to say that it's a morally correct decision. But it's a very pragmatic decision because in that part of the world, the Russia war in Ukraine, that's not a moral question. But second, I think the question that you asked, well, does it serve India well? Multi-alignment. I think for the longest part, it has. It's like you said, it's probably some advanced version of non-alignment. But because India has diverse interests, just like any other country, with regard to energy, arms, economy, trade, and everything, and it seeks a strategy which serves that best. And multi-alignment also means you're looking at all sorts of regions. So India is also sort of, I think, placed geographically placed well, where it's sort of it can look to the east, it can look to the west, it can look to sort of to West Asia, it can look to sort of Africa. So it's kind of well placed and in a way that also allows it to have that sort of multi-alignment kind of strategy, right? Imagine if India was Latin America, probably that wouldn't be an option, right? Because it's too close to the devil, as they say. It's in the devil's backyard. But yeah, so it's kind of a geographical necessity for India. But yes, you're right. At times, it may seem like that, well, India then has no allies. But that only happens, I think, in times of when you have sort of very outlier, vindictive leaders like Donald Trump. Uh, no strategy, I think no policies can be made with sort of irrational actors in mind. And Trump is almost an irrational actor there, right? So I think multi-alignment as a strategy works for India for most rational times. And even like, for instance, recently when Trump imposed tariffs, the first thing that Modi did was actually go to SEO. It's an organization that India trying to sort of move away from, but India had that option of quickly going to the SEO, right? So, so it is a strategy I think that works for India, and in general, I think it's a good strategy.
When I speak with my African colleagues about the UN Security Council, we have a very good discussion, and it's often a tough discussion from the African perspectives. India also doesn't have a permanent seat at the
Yeah.
UN Security Council. And I would like to ask from diplomatic point of view, how do you evaluate this development? And do you think that it's sort of similar how Africa is treated, sort of excluded from the multilateral institution because it's led by the Western powers?
Right. I mean, when it comes to India, I think India is probably in a better place. Not in terms of you know what its claims are, but in terms of how it is treated, right? I think with India being this emerging power, rising power, whatever, and the kind of coalitions it has been able to generate with, say, on climate change and others. So India, I think, is in a much better position than, say, a lot of African countries are because, like African countries, they all have to band together, 53 of them, to push for one vote, and India is one country pushing for one vote, right? But sort of, I think the UN permanent seat at the UN. I mean, in the past few years, there was a lot of chatter about it in India. I think about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago, when I think India was kind of being seen as this rising power and all of that, right? But in the past few years, I think as the United Nations itself has seem to be waning in importance. That in a way, and plus when it is kind of become more and more obvious that the path to that permanent Security Council seat is, it's a long journey, and probably that might not happen. So I think it's gone a bit down in India's priority as sort of to invest a lot of sort of its resources in wanting a permanent seat, because also there are other multilateral avenues where India get some kind of recognition at G20, at, there are other multilateral avenues where India goes to. So I think that obsession with the UN permanent seat has sort of gone down in the past few years. It may be because of the waning importance of the UN. It may be because of the rise of other multilateral institutions. It may be because two of the most important conflicts we've had in the current time, actually three if you include India and India's sort of short war with Pakistan, in Israel, Palestine, in Russia, Ukraine, and in India, Pakistan, UN has had literally no role. So I think that obsession has gone down. But then, of course, there is a question about whether India will be a great power when India wants to be a great power. In fact, Ram Guha, who's a historian, actually asked whether India, should India actually even aspire to be a great power? What is there to be a great power? What does it mean to be a great power? All kinds of problems that India has, India should focus more on its own domestic issues, on like I mentioned, 640 million people below poverty line, rather than worrying about some sort of abstract metric of global power.
We speak about India and Africa as well. And can we compare how successful is India's diplomacy in Africa? Because we see what China is doing in Africa. And people always compare then India and China. So what's your opinion about India's diplomacy in Africa? And maybe you see some room for improvements, maybe some little changes that you might mention.
Yeah, I mean, India's sort of relationship with Africa, at least during the 20th century, it was largely driven by this anti-colonial rhetoric and solidarity, but it never had a very strong economic component, right? Wherein actually large sort of Indian diaspora were very economically strong in the countries that they were in, South Africa and East Africa being examples. But in terms of economic relationship that India had with some of these countries, there wasn't much. And I think from the Nehruvian times, I think the Indian foreign policy had kept the Indian diaspora at a distance. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, because Indian diaspora, is not necessarily universally liked in Africa. They're also seen as sort of this sort of, petty bourgeois sort of, in that kind of role. So there's been that. But second, I think, at least from the Nehru sort of era, there was the sense that Indian diaspora looks more towards India, then contribute to the country, then contribute politically to the country that they were in, for instance, East Africa and South Africa. So Nehru had made it very clear that you can't be sitting on the fence when it comes to colonialism and all such issues when in the country that you are in. You don't look towards India to save you, right? So you have to be politically part of the country that you are in. And that, in a way, I think, sort of despite having a large diaspora in Africa, India had kept them at a distance. India only started cultivating those links, I think, after China went in the 90s into Africa. So it was only then, I think, India started developing. So first, India started cultivating its diaspora, increasing links with its diaspora. And then, India's initiatives in Africa, countries of Africa have followed actually whatever China has done, right? China has this Africa summits, and then India wants to have the Africa summits. So I think it's followed China rather than being proactive about sort of developing relationships with African countries.
There are some articles and publications about the Hindu nationalism and its impact on contemporary diplomatic identity and sort of like the forming of how India's diplomacy is working abroad. But then there are some voices about India's secular sort of system, pluralistic diplomatic brand, and things like that, because India is not only like one religion or that sort of like the structure of the society. We know India is very multinational anyway. So how do you see this Hindi nationalism? Is it influential, or is it just the hype that some authors are trying to export?
Yeah. No, I mean, sort of the Hindutva, which is sort of this Hindu nationalism, this right wing sort of Hindu nationalism. It is certainly, I mean, in case of how India sees itself, in case of India's identity, it's changing a lot domestically. India is no more the plural secular country that it used to be, and it's sort of um, extremely sort of violent towards its domestic sort of minorities, including Muslims, Dalits. So there is of course. A lot in that, a lot of that is true, that, Indian domestic identity is transforming rapidly. And India is also becoming far more and more authoritarian under the current government. So there is that. But interestingly, in terms of India's diplomatic identity, in terms of India's image in the world, I think it still largely plays to that very secular, pluralistic sort of diplomatic brand. If you think about like our Prime Minister and Narendra Modi, what is he known for? When he travels abroad, he's always hugging people. He's always smiling. He's seen as this sort of gentle grandpa. He has the gentle grandpa, whatever image abroad. In India, he never smiles. If you look at any of his speeches, you will never see him smiling. He is this sort of strong authoritarian leader. And there is a complete mismatch between, I think, India's external projection of itself as this, secular, plural country, which wants to be seen, which wants to become great power through that identity. That's how India affects itself. We are a different power from, say, China, because we are not authoritarian, we are nice, we are plural, we are democratic, and so on and so forth. While all of that is backsliding within India. So, but over time, I do think so. But that sort of domestic authoritarianism is also increasingly seeping into India's foreign policy and India's foreign policy projection. So we've had instances where Indian foreign sort of, India has allegedly tried to assassinate sort of Indians abroad, a bit like what, Russia's done or Israel has done. So India has taken on those kind of functions. But also Indian diplomatic missions, they have become far more assertive in terms of, say, policing our diaspora or keeping check on the diaspora. So a lot of it is slowly changing. But in terms of, I think, the diplomatic image that India has, it still sort of caters to that constituency which looks at India as the secular, pluralistic country. Think of, for instance, India's biggest foreign policy event in the past few years, which was the G20 summit that India held. That was all the sort of terminologies that were used there. For instance, again, the Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, which is that the world is our home, and the whole idea of what Prime Minister Modi calls Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas basically means integrated development. All of those are about plural ideas, and that is the projection that India does. But like I said, how far that can continue when India has become very authoritarian, that is sort of open to question.
The last question for today's interview. You are a historian, but you are also very in international relations, because I can feel that from your books and from your publications. What would you recommend for young researchers, our viewers, to research about India's diplomatic identity? Something maybe you found sort of under research, or maybe we don't have that many publications, and you consider that as a very important aspect of the India's diplomacy.
Right. I mean, when I was doing my PhD, so we had our professor, Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan. He said one day in class that, if you want to research about India, take any period of Indian diplomatic history and write a diplomatic history. And he said, I'm quite sure you will not find anything on Indian diplomatic history, on any incident or any period of Indian diplomatic history, which was quite true. And that's changed quite a bit in recent years. But I think there are still large parts of sort of Indian diplomacy that we don't know anything about. Like the question that you asked about, India and Africa. A lot of what I said is based on, what is generally believed, right? But no one actually knows how Indian diaspora sort of was engaged or not engaged in the 1960s and 70s. India is assumed to be this India is, for instance, one of the greatest supporters of the anti-apartheid movement. But there's not a single book which will talk about how actually India helped the anti-apartheid movement. So there are these large parts of Indian diplomatic history that we know nothing about. It's all based in some ways on speculation or in some way on what is thought to be sort of a general consensus. So there is, I think, for if you're working in Indian diplomacy, I think forget about India's contemporary relations because everybody is looking at India's bilateral relations, contemporary relations. Go into the archives and look at Indian diplomatic history, or because there's immense amount of stuff that one can do, and that's actually what I did. I work in diplomatic history because you pick anything and you will be able to find a new story.
Dr. Thakur, many thanks for your insights, for sharing your research perspectives with us. I think India's diplomacy is a huge topic and it's a huge country, but still, I believe we should have more books, more publications, especially translated to English so people can read them worldwide. So I'm glad that we could develop this episode, and I want to say again, thank you for being on IR Thinker.
Thanks very much, Martin, for having me.